Thank you for the invitation to be here. I studied clinical and developmental psychology in Utrecht. In fact, at a time when the Uithof barely existed. So we studied in the center of town. I graduated in 1985, and we just moved here, actually, for the last couple of years. And I did my PhD at the, we didn't call it the ASU, the UMCU, the University Hospital, at the Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, the department of, or the section of family therapy. So it's good to be back at my alma mater, as it's called, and to talk about extreme food obsessions. If you want to see a short version of what I'll be talking about, you can watch my TED Talk. I did a TED Talk in November in Amsterdam for TEDx Amsterdam Women, which is a 10-minute talk. I was nervous as hell, but it was about healthy eating, and I enjoyed doing it. I was the only male speaker in a session with 400 women in the room, and also all women speakers. So I felt like it felt like being an honorary feminist. And feminism was the theme as well. So that's interesting. I work in Leiden currently, or I have been working there for a very, very long time, at a Center for Eating Disorders, which has national recognition. We have as a center of excellence. At any given time, we have roughly 700 patients in care. Last year, we saw 600 new patients, all ages, all genders, all psychiatric eating disorders. And we employ roughly 130 people. So it's a big place, but it's a nice place. Let's talk about obsessions. This must be pretty small in the back, right? Can you see this? You're young, you've got good eyes. Okay. So I do think we live in a time when ideals are really important. Ideals have always been important, and ideal images have always been important, but perhaps now more so than ever. So, of course, in the old days, we only had movie stars. Now there are, ideals are everywhere. The beauty ideal, of course, and the thin ideal have sort of merged. And there's been a lot of change over the past couple of decades in the beauty and the thin ideal. It used to be just being very, very thin, and now it's much more being fit is the new thin. And you're all on Instagram, of course, so you're exposed to all these trends on a daily basis. I luckily am not. For men, there's a muscular ideal, often combined with a thin ideal. Most men, or many men, want to be more muscular and thinner, which is an impossible combination, of course. And then, of course, there's perfectionism, which is also is something which is certainly encouraged by society. And all of these things can also interact in a way. And then there's the health ideal, which has been around, again, for a very, very long time, but perhaps it's increasing. I don't know. It's something we can discuss. But that's something I'll be talking about, but also going a little bit into thin ideal and perfectionism and going into the more traditional eating disorders. So who here would consider him or herself to be sort of preoccupied with your health? Show of hands, preoccupied with health. 3/4, roughly. Okay, so who considers himself or herself to be really preoccupied with the relationship between food and health? Almost the same number, right? Same people. Okay, food and health. Interesting. Let's talk about food and health. Can you do the... Yeah. Can you do the top one first? Let's do a little bit. I'll show you a little bit about what is called... Oh, the ABC News is good too. It's fine.
From an afternoon candy bar or French fries at dinner. You may not believe that trying to be too healthy can be a serious issue, even dangerous. But tonight, some of those who suffer from this little-known compulsion take us inside their meticulous and often maddening worlds. Here's my Nightline co-anchor, Juju Chang.
8 a.m. Breakfast time in Santa Monica, California.
I'm always afraid to mess this up.
Jenny Victor is meticulously preparing her meal.
If something doesn't come out the way I want it to, I will just throw it away.
But in Jenny's mind, something's gone terribly wrong.
I am not doing this very well. It's a major fail. I know that if I eat it, it's not going to be appetizing to me.
She's an extreme perfectionist. Not only must it look perfect, it has to be perfectly nutritious.
This is coconut oil that I like to mash into. And see, I don't deprive myself of calories. I want to nourish my body and eat well.
But her compulsive attention to every morsel has morphed into a full-blown eating disorder, one you might have never heard of. It's called orthorexia nervosa, which literally means a fixation with righteous eating.
Orthorexia has taken a huge toll on my body. I recently found out that I have adrenal fatigue and an underactive thyroid. And, I haven't had a period in almost a year.
In a nation where 1/3 of adults are obese, you'd think an obsession with healthy food would be a good thing. But you'd be wrong.
Well, when you have orthorexia, every single day is full of anxiety over food.
There's been little research on orthorexia, and it's not listed in the official manual for psychological disorders.
I'm scared of gluten, I'm scared of grains. Even eating like a sweet potato for breakfast, I wonder how much sugar is in it.
We don't really know how prevalent orthorexia is. I think in some measures it's a reflection upon the obsession that part of our society has with food.
Jenny was 17 when she says her eating disorder began taking over her thoughts. 6 years later, every day is still a battle.
I start to get fidgety because I'm so nervous about what to eat.
She's struggling mightily over whether or not to order a coconut milk latte.
The drink is called Immortal. I know it's good for me. I know it's actually really healthy.
She orders the latte,
I'll do it.
revealing a clue as to why she's feeling so anxious.
A day like today when I didn't work out at all, I almost don't feel like I deserve as many calories. And ordering a drink like that, kind of a big step for me.
Okay. This goes on for 4.5 more minutes, but it's too long. What do you notice in this clip? What are words that stand out for you about this young woman? Shout. Obsession. Yeah, she called it a compulsion in the beginning. Yeah, interesting. Anxiety. Wanting control. Yeah. Obsessed with lots of things. Orthorexia nervosa. The words you mentioned stand out for me as well. That's pretty clear. And the last sentence she says is interesting too. She says, I don't feel that I deserve this coconut latte. This is California, so everyone's crazy there anyway. And they're about 20 years ahead when it comes to food fads. So can you get a coconut latte here everywhere? No, I don't think so. Not regularly. So we're going to have that in 10 years probably. So orthorexia nervosa sounds really, really medical. It sounds a little bit like anorexia nervosa, like it's a sister disorder. And it was, actually, the phrase was coined by a man called Steve Bratman in 1997. So it's been around for 20 years, 21 years. So it's not new. News media in this country keep portraying it as a new disorder. Well, first of all, it's not new. Second of all, it may not be a disorder, but we'll get into that shortly. So Bratman published his first paper in a yoga magazine. And he is currently, he's a, what's it called? He's an doctor. He's a medical physician, and he's had different positions, but he's sort of He picked this up, of course, in California. And orthorexia essentially refers to a healthy food dependence and a fixation on healthy food. That's how we first defined it. And the focus is on the quality of food and not so much on the quantity or the calories. And there must be an over-concern related to the food. So you must be indeed preoccupied with it and also concerned with consequences of unhealthy food. And they're expressed in strict dietary restrictions. So Bratman was really smart in coining these words, orthorexia nervosa, because from day one, everyone thought that this is a real disorder. And again, too, in the clip on the news, the person immediately says she suffers from a serious eating disorder, even though it's not mentioned anywhere, but that's generally how orthorexia nervosa is presented and perceived, which is interesting. Very recently, Bratman's still around, as you can see. Dunn and Bratman presented diagnostic criteria for orthorexia nervosa, and it's good to read these. We'll read a little bit. The idea is that there are no formal classification or diagnostic criteria for orthorexia nervosa. So it's good that someone proposes criteria, but there's no official recognition of these criteria. And I don't think that in the field of psychiatry or eating disorders we fully agree with these criteria. So we can have a look as to what's been proposed almost 20 years after the first publication. So it says that orthorexia nervosa criterion A, it's got two criteria, is an obsessive focus on healthy eating as defined by a dietary theory or a set of beliefs whose specific details may vary, marked by an exaggerated emotional distress in relationship to food choices perceived as unhealthy. Weight loss may ensue as a result of dietary choices, but this is not a primary goal, as with anorexia nervosa, for example, or bulimia nervosa. As evidenced by the following: compulsive behavior and or mental preoccupation regarding affirmative or restrictive dietary practices believed by the individual to promote optimum health. So there's a clear connection between the idea of health and compulsory behaviors regarding dietary practices. Violation of these self-imposed dietary rules causes exaggerated fear of disease, sense of personal impurity, and or negative physical sensations accompanied by anxiety or shame. So there's a psychological consequences of violation of these rules. So as in the example, drinking the coconut latte was perhaps almost a violation of her dietary rules, and certainly leads to anxiety and choice anxiety as to what to drink. The dietary restrictions escalate over time and may come to include elimination of entire food groups and involve progressively more frequent and or severe cleanses, which are partial fasts, regarded as purifying or detoxifying. This escalation commonly leads to weight loss, but the desire to lose weight is absent, hidden, or subordinated to ideations about healthy eating. So they sort of paint the picture of dietary restriction, but based on the idea that it should enhance health. The clear connection between health and food is made within these diagnostic criteria. Does anyone recognize him or herself in this part? Let's be confronting. You do? Yeah? Interesting. Okay. Criterion B, the compulsive behavior and or mental preoccupation become clinically impairing by any of the following: malnutrition, severe weight loss, or other medical complications from restricted diet. Intrapersonal distress or impairment of social, academic, or vocational functioning secondary to beliefs or behaviors about healthy diet. And positive body image. Self-worth, identity, and or satisfaction is excessively dependent on the compliance with these self-defined healthy eating behaviors. So my guess would be that in this room, in general, people who come to a talk like this, a huge number will more or less fulfill these criteria, or at least want to fulfill these criteria, find them desirable. And if I'm wrong, I will hear so later. But this part, because this, I mean, it's quite extreme, but so what? I'll get back to that. But this part is more difficult. Essentially, they're saying that these behaviors in criterion A should be clinically impairing. And impairment in general in psychiatry refers to suffering. If you suffer from your behaviors or your thoughts, that is seen as one of the essentials to call something a disorder. And the other thing is impairment. If you harm yourself in the sense that it leads to malnutrition or, for example, stunted growth, severe weight loss, or other medical complications, that's called impairment. Intrapersonal distress or impairment, for example, in social functioning, that again is considered impairment and is another sign of something perhaps being a disorder. So this is the list of DSM-5 feeding and eating disorders. And the feeding disorders are sort of the top three. They mainly occur in children, not so much in teens and adolescents. And these are the psychiatric eating disorders that mainly occur in teens, adolescents, young adults. And the primary, the peak age of incidence, so when the disorder occurs for the first time, is between 15 and 25. What you will notice here is that orthorexia nervosa is not listed as one of these disorders. So despite the fact that it sounds very medical, orthorexia nervosa is not a recognized psychiatric disorder at all. The DSM-5 was published in 2013, and orthorexia nervosa wasn't even considered as a potential disorder to be included in this diagnostic manual. And I honestly think that, at least in my lifetime, I don't think it will ever be considered as a psychiatric disorder. Why? Well, simply because, first of all, in the field, we are very, very restrictive in adding new diagnoses to a diagnostic manual. If you add a diagnosis, it has huge consequences. For example, for insurance reimbursement, a group of individuals will suddenly or can be classified as suffering from a psychiatric disorder. So we need to be very conservative when thinking about new disorders. One of the things that the DSM-5 committee did debate was whether obesity should be considered a psychiatric disorder. And for many reasons, obesity was not considered a psychiatric disorder. And if it were, roughly 40% of the individuals, the population in the United States, would suddenly have been suffering from a psychiatric disorder. And that, of course, is insane and impossible. So just as an example of the process of entering new diagnoses to the DSM, let's take binge eating disorder. Binge eating disorder is a disorder which is characterized in the sense that these individuals have large binges. They eat huge amount of food in a relatively short period of time. But in contrast with individuals with bulimia nervosa, they do not engage in self-induced vomiting or laxative abuse or excessive exercise. So if you have multiple binges per week, your weight goes up. That's the consequence. So roughly half of these individuals are overweight or obese. Binge eating disorder was mentioned in the DSM-4, so the previous version, under a special section which indicated that it needed more research before it could be included in the next, or considered to be included in the next version of the DSM-5. Binge eating disorder is quite common. Roughly in 1% of the population suffers from binge eating disorder, men and women in equal properties. And the field of eating disorders really jumped on binge eating disorders. So by the time the DSM-5 committee had to look at the evidence for binge eating disorder in order to include it in the DSM, there was roughly at least 5 stacks of scientific papers this high, which were published between 1994, when it was first proposed, to 2012. So there was a huge amount of evidence about the epidemiology, the course, the treatment, many treatment studies. And still the committee said, should it really be included? They were doubtful about that, and they included it and received a lot of criticism from others outside of the field of eating disorders that now we could barely call this a disorder, and now gluttony is part of the psychiatric diagnostic criteria, while we within the eating disorder field felt that because of the huge amount of evidence, and that the evidence pointed that it was a separate disorder, it was distinguishable from anorexia and bulimia nervosa, it required a special treatment, we thought that it fulfilled all the criteria for a specific separate disorder, and yet still we received a lot of criticism from the field. On orthorexia nervosa, there's hardly any research. So I'll have to disappoint you in that respect, that I don't have a lot of data to present to you, in fact, very few. So the number of studies on orthorexia nervosa are increasing, but the numbers are very, very small. So I don't expect that within 5, 10, or even 20 years we'll have enough research data and enough hard evidence to even consider orthorexia nervosa as a new diagnostic criterion within the DSM-5. Sorry to disappoint you, if you find that disappointing. I actually don't, because I think it is really important to be very conservative about establishing new diagnoses. So orthorexia nervosa, what is it? The behaviors exist. We don't know much about the impairment, but I'll get to that. So what is orthorexia nervosa? Does it have to be, should we consider it as a special syndrome, perhaps a disorder? If you compare orthorexia nervosa, the ON is the abbreviation, of course, of orthorexia nervosa, with eating disorders, the differences are quite clear. So in orthorexia nervosa, as was shown earlier, the fear of weight gain really lacks. And that is a major difference with individuals with eating disorders. Almost all individuals with eating disorders, with psychiatric eating disorders, feel fat and want to become thin. Individuals with orthorexia nervosa will say, no, I want to eat really, really healthy to become, to increase my health or to guarantee my future health. So that's a big difference. The trouble is that not all individuals with eating disorders will actually tell you that they feel fat and they want to be thin. So sometimes it's really, really hard to discern whether there is a true fear of weight gain, and it usually takes a long, long time. Well, not usually. It sometimes takes a long time to actually find this out. In eating disorders, certainly in anorexia and bulimia nervosa, there are more females than males, and in orthorexia nervosa, there does not seem to be a gender imbalance. And again, the focus in orthorexia nervosa is on the quality of food and not so much on the quantity of food. So orthorexia nervosa does not seem to be easily equated with eating disorders in general. Another thought could be that given the compulsions and the obsessions with health and healthy food, you could consider orthorexia nervosa as an obsessive-compulsive disorder. And if you compare those two, you could say that content-wise, orthorexia nervosa specifically aims, or people with orthorexia nervosa are obsessed or have compulsions about eating and food-specific items, while people with OCD in general do not. They are obsessed with, could be obsessed with germs or with hand washing or with counting or with checking, but not so much with eating and food specific aspects. So that's a huge difference content wise. And consequences For orthorexia nervosa, the consequences are generally health-related and perhaps lead to social isolation if you can never go out to dinner anymore. And with OCD in general, it also leads to social isolation in general. So as I mentioned, there is very little research on orthorexia nervosa, and one of the reasons is that there are really no good assessment instruments. So some questionnaires have been developed, but the psychometric properties of these questionnaires are questionable. There's no interview. We don't particularly agree on the diagnostic criteria. The criteria I presented by Dunn and Bratman were published in 2015. They're relatively recent. I know that some groups in the world are working on assessment instruments, but then again, you need to test the psychometric properties of these assessment instruments. You have to interview individuals with and without these behaviors to test whether they will fulfill the criteria mentioned in their self-report questionnaires. And of course, the question is, what is the gold standard? To what are we going to test these criteria? So that's really is a big issue. If we don't agree on the criteria, we don't have good assessment instruments, then how can we really discern what this behavior is? The research that has been done was conducted in high-risk groups. So dietitians, medical students, people who go to fitness, and in these groups, really high percentages of people with ON tendencies, as it's called, or with orthorexia nervosa have been established. But that refers mainly to the behaviors mentioned under criterion A. So the preoccupation, the strict dietary rules, the increase in dietary rules, that is what many people within specific high-risk groups recognize. Up to 3/4 in some samples of the people endorse these different behaviors. If you then look at the impairment side and you ask these people, are you suffering from the behaviors that you're doing? Are you harming yourself? Are you harming others? Does it cause impairment? Then the figures drop dramatically, and a relatively recent study in college students showed that the figure dropped to roughly 1% of the sample that actually fulfilled the impairment criteria for orthorexia nervosa. So a huge number of people endorse the healthy part and the health food link part, but relatively few people perhaps suffer from their behaviors. Perhaps they may even enjoy these behaviors, but we'll get to that too. I'm running out of time already. Oh dear. Another thing is that, do we really need orthorexia nervosa as a separate disorder? We could consider it as a obsessive compulsive disorder, or we could say that it may be part of an eating disorder. Of the patients that we see at our clinic who suffer from an eating disorder, quite a few would fulfill the criteria for orthorexia nervosa, simply because quite a few patients with anorexia nervosa will say, when I regain my weight to a healthy weight level, I want only to do that with healthy food, whatever that may be. If you were to consider anorexia nervosa or orthorexia nervosa an eating disorder, it would perhaps fit best under the criteria for an avoidant and restrictive food intake disorder. We use the abbreviation of RFID. Although you wouldn't recognize that immediately, but perhaps it could fit within this realm. Not very important. So one of the things that I find, let me turn this off for a sec. It's not going to help me. One of the things that I find interesting is this huge increase in attention for healthy food obsessions or for orthorexia nervosa. I get about a request from the media at least monthly about this topic, and they've been asking me for 10 years, and every time they say, oh, we found something new, I say, sorry, it's been around for 20 years. I try to dissuade them from this topic. So one of the questions is this behavior a hype? Is it a trend? Is it perhaps a religion? Or has it become part of mainstream culture? And there are quite a few societal actions, I would almost say, which sort of help us focus more on health and food. And one of the things is the obesity epidemic. Luckily in this country, we've more or less stopped the increase in the percentage of individuals and certainly of children who become obese. But we've been told, and children are told in elementary school and high school, to eat healthy, to eat more fruit and vegetables, and to exercise more. We had to balance our diet. We had, if you eat too much on today, then you have a Balansdag the second day. So there's been a huge campaign which has been funded by the government for us to eat more healthily and exercise more as part of the obesity prevention. Food safety has become much more prevalent in all of our minds. And of course, most recently, the fipronil egg scandal is one of the things, and there are many, many more. We are worried about where our food comes from. We are more and more worried how it is produced, what is produced. We are bombarded with newspaper articles and certainly on social media about the quality of the food, the quality of prepared food, and how we are using that. And of course, we're worried about genetically modified food as well. So anything regarding food safety is an issue. Animal well-being has increased dramatically. Again, in the Netherlands, we even have a political party which has animal well-being in its name. So it's become a big, big issue. I could have put up climate change here as well, where we're informed about how much water, how much land a cow uses, how much CO2 a cow produces. The flexitarianism, vegetarianism, and veganism are on the rise. So we have become more and more focused on this part. And then, of course, there's the relationship between food and health, lifestyle bloggers. And there's a huge number of bloggers, because anyone can go on social media and become an instant hit or famous, and actually even earn a living by posting on Instagram or other social media. And that has become a huge industry. It is really an industry. And one of the things that I find really interesting is that many, many food bloggers link food or specific foods to health claims. So, for example, in the United States, and perhaps here as well, but kale, as the vegetable kale, has become hugely popular. There are all sorts of kale shakes and drinks. Kale is boerenkool in Dutch. And we've known that for centuries, and people eat it. But why juice it? I really wouldn't know. We've had, of course, there's all sorts of supplements and superfoods have become in. Suddenly we had to eat berries and God knows what in huge quantities. Antioxidants became extremely important. And then we need to detox, because apparently when we live our normal life and we eat stuff, we become more toxic. I have no idea who thought that up, but okay. We need to cleanse. And especially in big cities, there are juice bars. You need to eat juice and stuff. One of the things about health claims that most bloggers make is that they're based on pseudoscience. By that I mean that most of these explanations and theories sound really scientific, but they're rubbish. If you look into actually what these theories in general say, and you look at the scientific data, usually there's absolutely no evidence, or the evidence points in the other direction. But then it's really nice to think now, I mean, there are hundreds of these kinds of theories linked to diets. It's really nice to adopt a diet with a pseudoscientific philosophy behind it, and to do that for a while and think, okay, I really believe in what they're saying. But don't think it has a scientific basis, because in general, it doesn't. And really, really, you're all well-educated, well-thinking individuals. We all fall into this trap. We all tend to believe what we read if it has a nice scientific ring to it. Unfortunately, really, most of it is absolute rubbish. And then there's immortality. I think that one of the things that certainly individuals who fulfill the criteria for orthorexia nervosa, but others who are overly concerned with health and food, are concerned about disease. The fantasy is that if I eat healthy, I will never get cancer. In fact, perhaps the fantasy even is, if I eat healthy for the rest of my life, I will live forever. I will never die. There's actually a whole serious scientific community looking into death as something which can be resolved. And then, of course, social media. Lastly, social media and peer pressure is huge. So social media have a huge influence on individuals. And as I mentioned, anyone can be a blogger. Anyone can tell you whatever they want about food and stuff. We've had some great examples. So this is in Dutch, but this is The Green Happiness, a duo of dietitians who write cookbooks with a huge number of spelling mistakes, which they sell for 50 euros a piece. So my guess is they of course have a staff. My guess is they have become, or they will become, fairly rich as a result. But they've also presented, they're presenting all sorts of comments, and they can help you with almost anything. So these are stomach ailments, weight problems, hormonal disbalances, pregnancy, diabetes, allergies. They provide all sorts of services. And I think this cartoon says a lot. It's, how do you translate that? A gebakken luchtoven. A lot of what they've produced is hot air. That's the word. One of the things these ladies presented, for example, was that every morning you need to use, coconut oil or some oil. Use 2 tablespoons, put them in your mouth, rinse your mouth with this oil, because that would detox everything, detox your body from the day before. That's fine, that's harmless, but it's rubbish. It's fine, as long as it's harmless, I'm fine with it. Vitamin stores, and of course, the toxic heavy metal cleanse. The idea, again, that we are becoming more and more toxic as a result of life. So, getting back to the beginning, I hope I've shown you that orthorexia nervosa as a behavior exists, perhaps that the number of individuals that actually suffer from this disorder may be very, very few. They don't come to clinics in droves to ask for treatment. And in general, I would say, I make the distinction between normal/healthy behavior on the one hand and disordered or illness-driven behavior on the other hand. Many, many people wonder whether what they're doing with regards to health and food, whether or not that is a disorder. Orthorexia nervosa, of course, is not a formal disorder, and if you suffer from it, then it might be a disorder because you're suffering, and suffering is never good. But one of the things that I like to put in between is odd behavior. And I think we should be very, very tolerant towards odd behavior, and I think people have a right to odd behavior. If you like the diets that you're doing, if you enjoy it, if it's fun for you to play with diets, if it's fun to adhere to whatever crazy idea bloggers might present with regard to that specific diet, fine. I hope you're happy with it. I hope you get some fun out of it, as long as it doesn't harm yourself or harm others. as long as it doesn't lead to serious weight loss and nutritional imbalances, that's fine. Many people who start on a diet, whatever diet that is, stop within a couple of weeks or perhaps months. So it's really hard to adhere to relatively strict diets. That's fine too. If the fun is over, just stop. Another thing which research has shown is that people who say they strictly adhere to a diet, in fact, don't. So they'll eat all sorts of stuff which is not part of the diet, but they'll never tell anyone else about that, which is fine too. So I'm hugely in favor of odd behavior, and I think that people have a right to odd behavior. In fact, I think we should promote odd behavior in all sorts of ways. And it would certainly help, it's a little sidestep, but it would help decrease the number of children and individuals diagnosed with ADHD or autism spectrum disorder, because that, again, too, is part of our community's intolerance with odd behaviors. But that's another story. Thank you.